Racist neighbor sets black family's house on fire, then faces legal justice. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The night sky was painted in shades of orange and black, the flames devouring the Johnsons' home like a hungry beast. Thick plumes of smoke billowed into the air, twisting and curling, a dark omen against the stars. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with every second, but they were too late. The fire had already taken everything. Malcolm Johnson stood frozen on the sidewalk, his hands raised in the air, dressed in an orange jumpsuit. His wife, Lisa, clung to their son, Elijah, her body shaking as she sobbed into his small shoulders. The boy, just 10 years old, had never seen his father like this before. Helpless, broken, stripped of everything. Police cruisers lined the street, their flashing red and blue lights casting eerie reflections on the burning wreckage. Firefighters rushed to contain the flames, but there was little left to save. The heat radiated off the collapsing structure, forcing the growing crowd of neighbors to keep their distance. Among them stood Henry Whitaker. He watched with a smirk on his face, arms crossed, barely concealing his satisfaction. His expression carried no sympathy, no shock, only triumph. Lisa turned, catching sight of him, her grief twisted into rage. She took a step forward, her hands balling into fists. "You did this!" she screamed, her voice raw. Malcolm reached out, pulling her back. "Lisa, no," but she wouldn't be silenced. "You set our house on fire. You monster. You've hated us from the moment we moved in." "I know it was you," Henry chuckled, shaking his head. Now, Lisa," he said, voice dripping with mockery. "That's a serious accusation. You really think I'd do something like that?" Lisa's eyes burned with fury. "You've been threatening us for years. You called the cops on us for nothing. You told us we didn't belong here. And now," she gestured wildly at the flames, her whole body trembling. "Now this," Henry shrugged. "Looks like an accident to me." Lisa lunged forward, but Malcolm held her tight. "We're not doing this now," he whispered, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Elijah clung to his mother's side, his wide, tear-filled eyes darting between his parents and the burning house. "Where are we gonna go?" he whimpered. Lisa knelt beside him, her voice breaking. "I don't know, baby." The police finally stepped in. Officer Reynolds, a man who had never bothered to hide his disdain for Malcolm, approached with a notepad in hand. "What happened here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly interested in the answer. Lisa scoffed. "What happened? Someone burned down our house. That's what happened." Reynolds nodded slowly, as if she had just told him the weather forecast. "And you have proof of that?" Lisa's mouth fell open. "Are you serious?" Malcolm inhaled sharply, forcing himself to remain calm. "Check the security footage," he said. "We installed cameras last year after Henry started harassing us." Reynolds glanced toward the house. "Can't imagine there's much footage left to check." Malcolm's hands clenched into fists. "The feed is backed up to the cloud." Reynolds exhaled through his nose, clearly irritated. "All right, we'll look into it." Henry let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Wasting taxpayer dollars on nonsense." Lisa spun around. "You really think you're gonna get away with this?" Henry spread his arms. "I don't know what you're talking about, sweetheart." Malcolm took Lisa's hand. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's go." Lisa turned to him in disbelief. "Go where, Malcolm? We have nothing left." Malcolm swallowed hard. He didn't have an answer. He had just gotten out of prison 2 weeks ago. 10 years locked away for a crime he didn't commit. And now, just when he thought he could rebuild, he was standing in the ashes of his past and his future. Henry's smirk deepened as he watched them walk away. Malcolm didn't turn back, but he could feel Henry's eyes on him, and he silently promised himself this wasn't over. The Johnsons spent the night at Lisa's best friend's house. Candace welcomed them in without hesitation, setting up the guest room for Lisa and Elijah, while Malcolm took the couch. Lisa sat at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee in front of her. Her fingers drummed restlessly against the ceramic. "I can't believe this is happening," she whispered. Malcolm sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "We'll figure it out." Lisa let out a humorless laugh. "Figure it out? Malcolm, our home is gone. Our son is terrified. And the police don't care." "They will care," Malcolm said, his voice low but firm. "Once they see the footage." Lisa sighed, running a hand through her curls. "What if it's gone? What if Henry—" A knock at the door interrupted her. Candace appeared from the hallway. "It's the police." Lisa's stomach dropped. Malcolm exhaled, bracing himself. "Let them in." Reynolds stepped inside, removing his hat. His partner, Officer Diaz, followed. Unlike Reynolds, Diaz looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Got some news for you," Reynolds said. Malcolm crossed his arms. "Go on." Reynolds clicked his tongue. "Security footage is gone." Lisa shot up from her seat. "What?" "System got wiped." Reynolds continued, completely unfazed. "No footage, no case." Lisa stared at him, shaking her head. "No, that's not possible. The footage is backed up. Can't be gone." Reynolds shrugged. "I don't know what to tell you." Lisa felt like she was going to explode. "Are you even trying to find out who did this? Or are you just protecting Henry like you always do?" Reynolds smirked. "I go where the evidence takes me." Lisa's eyes burned. "And what evidence do you have?" Reynolds put his hat back on. "None." And with that, he turned and walked out. Diaz lingered for a moment, giving Malcolm a look. It wasn't sympathy, but it wasn't indifference either. Then he followed Reynolds out the door. Lisa gripped the edge of the table, her whole body shaking. "He's covering for Henry." Malcolm exhaled slowly. "I know." Lisa looked at him, desperation in her eyes. "What do we do, Malcolm?" He met her gaze, steady and unyielding. "We fight." The next morning, Malcolm made some calls. He reached out to an old friend from his time in prison, a man who knew people in the tech world. By midday, Malcolm had an answer. The footage hadn't been erased. Someone had hacked the system and stolen it. And that meant only one thing. Henry was more desperate than he let on. Lisa clutched Malcolm's arm. "This proves he's guilty." Malcolm nodded. "Yeah, but the police won't care." Lisa swallowed hard. "Then what do we do?" Malcolm glanced at Elijah, who sat on the couch, clutching a toy car, his small face tight with worry. "We go public." Lisa's eyes widened. "You mean?" Malcolm pulled out his phone. "If the cops won't fight for us, we'll make the world listen." He tapped the screen. And just like that, the Johnson story went viral. This is the proof we needed. The sun had barely risen when Lisa's phone started buzzing. She sat up groggily, reaching for it, but Malcolm was already awake. He sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his own phone, his face unreadable. Lisa blinked at the number flashing on her screen. Unknown caller. She hesitated before answering. "Hello." A deep voice crackled on the other end. "Mrs. Johnson, you don't know me, but I know Henry Whitaker, and I know what he did." Lisa sat up straighter. "Who is this?" The man hesitated. "Let's just say I used to be close to him. Close enough to know that he's dangerous. You're playing with fire, and if you don't have a real plan, you won't win this fight." Lisa's stomach twisted. "Why are you calling?" "Because I can prove Henry set that fire." Lisa's grip tightened on the phone. "How?" The man exhaled. "Meet me. Tonight. I'll bring you the evidence." Lisa's heart pounded. "Where?" The caller gave her an address, a rundown diner on the outskirts of town. "Come alone." Lisa's hands shook as she ended the call. Malcolm had been listening. "That's a setup." Lisa nodded, still gripping the phone. "Probably. But what if it's not?" Malcolm ran a hand down his face. "We don't have the luxury of trusting strangers." Lisa looked toward the living room, where Elijah sat watching cartoons, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. "We also don't have the luxury of doing nothing." Malcolm sighed. "I'm coming with you." Lisa nodded. "Then we go tonight." By the afternoon, the Johnson story had gained serious traction online. Major news outlets picked it up. The hashtags #Justice for the Johnsons and #Arrest Henry Whitaker were trending. People were demanding action. Lisa had barely put her phone down all day. Calls from reporters, civil rights activists, and even lawyers flooded in. Some wanted to help. Others just wanted a story. But one call stood out. "Mrs. Johnson," the voice said, professional and sharp. "This is Ava Carter from the Civil Liberties Defense League. We saw your story. If you're serious about fighting this, we want to help." Lisa's pulse quickened. "You're lawyers?" "We're more than lawyers. We specialize in cases where local authorities refuse to act. We have resources, investigative teams, media leverage. If you want to take this to court, we're in." Lisa's throat tightened. "You really think we can win?" Ava didn't hesitate. "We don't take cases we don't believe in." Lisa glanced at Malcolm. His eyes locked onto hers. They had a real shot. Lisa took a breath. "Then let's do it." That night, Malcolm and Lisa pulled into the nearly empty diner parking lot. The flickering neon sign cast eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. Lisa's palms were clammy. "I don't like this." Malcolm scanned the lot. "Neither do I. Stay close." They stepped inside. The diner smelled of old grease and burnt coffee. A man sat alone in the farthest booth, his baseball cap pulled low over his face. Lisa and Malcolm exchanged glances before approaching. The man looked up. His face was rough, weathered. His hands shook slightly as he reached for a cup of coffee. "You're Lisa Johnson," he said quietly. Lisa nodded. "And you are?" The man exhaled. "Mike Tanner. Used to work for Henry." Malcolm's posture stiffened. "Why are you helping us?" Mike let out a humorless chuckle. "Because Henry isn't just a racist. He's a psychopath. I covered for him for years, but this..." He shook his head. "Burning down a house with a kid inside? That's too far." Lisa's blood ran cold. "He knew Elijah was in there?" Mike looked her dead in the eye. "He hoped he was." Lisa's breath caught. Malcolm clenched his fists so hard his knuckles turned white. Mike reached into his jacket and pulled out a USB drive. He slid it across the table. Lisa hesitated before picking it up. "What's on this?" Mike's voice dropped lower. "Everything. Security footage from Henry's property. Shows him leaving his house the night of the fire. Text messages where he brags about taking care of a problem. Even a recording of him laughing about how the cops wouldn't do a damn thing." Lisa's hands trembled. Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Why give this to us?" Mike's eyes darkened. "Because I know how this ends. Henry's gotten away with too much for too long. Someone has to stop him." Lisa swallowed hard. "And what happens to you after this?" Mike let out a slow breath. "I disappear." He slid out of the booth, threw some cash on the table, and walked out without looking back. Lisa and Malcolm sat in stunned silence. Then Malcolm spoke. "We take this straight to the lawyers." Lisa nodded, gripping the USB tightly. "And we end this." The weight of the USB drive in Lisa's hand felt heavier than it should. It wasn't just a piece of plastic and metal, it was proof. Proof that Henry Whitaker had done this. Proof that he had laughed about it, confident that no one would ever touch him. Proof that the system had failed them again and again. Malcolm drove in silence, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles were bone white. The streetlights cast flickering shadows through the windshield. His jaw set in an expression Lisa knew all too well, controlled fury. "We go straight to Ava," he muttered. "No delays. No detours." Lisa nodded, clutching the USB as though someone might try to rip it from her hands at any moment. She had spent so much of her life fighting battles that weren't meant to be battles at all. Simply the right to exist, to live, to raise her son in peace. But this wasn't just a battle. This was war. As they pulled into Ava Carter's law office, a single lamp illuminated the front desk, casting long shadows along the walls. Ava herself was waiting inside, arms crossed, her sharp gaze flicking to the USB drive the moment Lisa held it up. "Tell me that's what I think it is," Ava said. Lisa slid it across the desk. "It's everything." Ava didn't waste a second. She plugged it into her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard as she opened file after file. The tension in the room thickened as the first video played. The grainy security footage showed Henry stepping out of his house late at night, glancing over his shoulder, and disappearing into the darkness, just hours before the fire. Then came the messages. Lisa clenched her fists as Ava scrolled through them. There it was, in Henry's own words. Got rid of the problem. Won't be seeing their kind around here anymore. Ava let out a slow breath. This is it, she murmured. This is the case. Lisa felt a cold shiver run down her spine. It should have felt like relief, but it didn't. Not yet. How do we make sure they actually do something with it? Malcolm asked, his voice calm, but edged with steel. Ava straightened. We go public. Full press release. Get it in the hands of journalists, civil rights organizations, politicians. Anyone who can make enough noise that the police department can't ignore it. Lisa hesitated. But if we go public, Henry will know we have this. Ava's expression darkened. He's already watching you. You saw what they did to your car. If we wait, they'll find a way to bury this. We strike first. Malcolm nodded. Do it. Ava picked up her phone and started making calls. Within minutes, she had lined up an exclusive with a major news outlet. By morning, Henry Whitaker's name wouldn't just be known in their town. It would be everywhere. But that also meant danger. Lisa barely had time to register that thought before her phone buzzed. A text message. No name attached. You think this ends with an arrest? You're making a mistake. She swallowed hard, turning the screen toward Malcolm. His face darkened. We need to get Elijah out of here, he said. Tonight. Lisa's hands trembled. Where can we take him? Ava glanced up from her laptop. Somewhere Henry wouldn't expect. Do you have family out of town? Lisa nodded. My sister, Vanessa. She's 2 hours away. Malcolm was already pulling out his phone. Then we leave now. The drive to Vanessa's house was quiet, tense. Elijah had fallen asleep in the back seat, unaware of the storm swirling around them. Lisa reached back and smoothed his curls, her heart aching. He deserved so much better than this. By the time they arrived, Vanessa was already waiting outside, arms crossed, worry etched into her face. You really think it's that bad? She asked as they stepped out. Lisa glanced back at their car, half expecting to see headlights following them in the distance. Yeah, she whispered. It's that bad. Inside, Elijah curled up on the couch, exhausted, while Lisa and Malcolm filled Vanessa in on everything. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with every word. You're gonna take that man down, Vanessa finally said. And when you do, I want front row seats. Lisa managed a small smile. I just want my son to be safe. He will be, Vanessa promised. Now, go do what you need to do. They left Elijah in her care and drove back home. The empty back seat a stark reminder of just how much was at stake. By the time they arrived, Ava had already released the story. News anchors were discussing it. Social media was exploding, and the police had no choice but to act. By noon the next day, Henry Whitaker was in handcuffs. But Lisa knew better than to celebrate just yet. This wasn't over. Not even close. The moment the news broke, everything changed. Lisa stood in the middle of her living room, phone buzzing with endless notifications. The image of Henry Whitaker being led out of his house in handcuffs was plastered across every major news station. Reporters dissected the case, legal analysts debated the charges, and online communities rallied around the Johnson family, demanding justice. But Lisa wasn't celebrating. She knew this was just the beginning. Malcolm sat on the couch, watching the coverage in silence. His arms were crossed, jaw clenched, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on him. This feels too easy, he murmured. Lisa knew what he meant. Henry had been untouchable for years, a man with connections, privilege, and the arrogance to believe he could burn down their home and walk away. He wasn't the type to go down without a fight. Ava's call confirmed it minutes later. They're trying to dismiss the case, she said, her voice sharp with frustration. His lawyers are claiming the evidence is circumstantial at best. They're saying he was framed. Lisa gripped the phone tighter. Framed? We have video, we have texts. And they have powerful friends, Ava cut in. The district attorney handling the case is dragging his feet. I have a feeling Henry's trying to cut a deal before this even goes to trial. Lisa felt a chill creep up her spine. You mean he could walk? Not if we keep the pressure on, Ava said. We need more. More proof, more witnesses, more voices. If we let up now, this whole thing disappears. Malcolm stood. Then we don't let up. Lisa nodded, her mind already racing. They needed to make sure Henry didn't walk away from this. By the time the preliminary hearing was announced, the town was divided. The protests outside the courthouse grew larger by the day, some demanding Henry's immediate conviction, others defending him, calling the charges a witch hunt. Lisa walked past the line of reporters, gripping Malcolm's hand as they entered the courthouse. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved in their faces, but she kept her focus ahead. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Henry sat at the defendant's table, looking as smug as ever, flanked by his high-powered legal team. His lawyer, a sleek, sharp-looking man named Alan Pierce, stood and addressed the judge. My client is a respected member of this community. The so-called evidence against him is nothing more than a smear campaign orchestrated by social media outrage. We request that these baseless charges be dismissed immediately. Lisa's blood boiled. Baseless? He burned their house down. He tried to kill them. Ava stood, her expression unreadable. Your Honor, the evidence is overwhelming. We have video footage placing Mr. Whitaker at the scene the night of the fire. We have text messages where he brags about getting rid of the Johnsons. We even have a witness willing to testify that he admitted to committing arson. The judge adjusted his glasses. Then let's hear from the witness. A hush fell over the courtroom as Mike Tanner was called to the stand. Lisa held her breath as he took his seat. He looked nervous but determined. He had risked everything to come forward. Ava approached him calmly. Mr. Tanner, you worked for Henry Whitaker for how many years? 10, Mike answered. And during that time, did you witness any discriminatory behavior toward the Johnson family? Mike nodded. Yeah. Henry never wanted them in the neighborhood. He talked about them all the time, said they lowered the value of the place. He made calls to the HOA, the police, anything to get them to leave. Ava nodded. And on the night of the fire, Mike swallowed hard. He told me what he was going to do. He laughed about it, said no one would ever pin it on him. Lisa squeezed Malcolm's hand. Ava continued, Did you try to stop him? Mike hesitated. I should have, but I was scared. Henry has a lot of power in this town. I didn't think anyone would believe me. Lisa clenched her jaw. That's how Henry got away with everything. Fear. Ava turned to the judge. Your Honor, we have one more piece of evidence. A recording. Lisa's pulse quickened. They hadn't discussed this. What recording? Ava pressed play. Henry's voice filled the courtroom. They won't have a house to go back to. Problem solved. The silence that followed was deafening. Henry's smug expression faltered for the first time. The judge cleared his throat. This case will proceed to trial. Lisa exhaled, relief crashing over her. But Malcolm remained still, watching Henry, because this wasn't over. Not yet. The tension in the courtroom was thick as Henry Whitaker's legal team scrambled to control the damage. His smirk was gone, his fingers tightening into a fist as the judge's decision echoed in the silent room. This case will proceed to trial. Lisa exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. It was a victory, but not the end. Henry wasn't in prison yet. And if they knew anything about men like him, it was that he wouldn't go down easily. As the courtroom emptied, reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, microphones shoved in their faces. Lisa gritted her teeth as questions flew at them. Mrs. Johnson, how do you feel about today's ruling? Do you believe Henry Whitaker will be convicted? Malcolm placed his mug down, leaning back. We weren't, and now we make sure other people aren't either. Lisa turned to him. You want to keep fighting? Malcolm shrugged. Not the way we had to fight this time. But yeah, there are too many families out there going through the same thing. If we can help, why wouldn't we? Lisa looked down at her hands, tracing the rim of her mug. I don't know if I have it in me to keep going like that. You don't have to do it alone. She looked at him, really looked at him. The man who had lost a decade of his life to a broken system. The man who had been forced to rebuild from nothing. The man who had stood by her, fought beside her, never once backing down. A small smile tugged at her lips. Then maybe we figure it out together. Malcolm nodded, squeezing her hand. For the first time in a long time, they weren't just surviving. They were planning for a future. The next morning, Lisa woke to an email from Ava. She had expected some kind of follow-up, maybe paperwork to finalize the case. What she didn't expect was an offer. Ava wanted Lisa to join her firm. She read the email twice, sitting up in bed. It wasn't a full-time position, but a consulting role, working with families who had been victims of hate crimes, discrimination, and wrongful convictions. Lisa's hands shook as she reached for her phone. Malcolm answered groggily. "You okay?" "Read this," she said, forwarding the email. There was a long pause before Malcolm let out a low whistle. "Damn, they want you on the front lines." Lisa exhaled. "I don't know if I can do this." "You can." She ran a hand through her hair. "It's just, I never saw myself doing something like this." Malcolm chuckled. "Neither did I, but here we are." Lisa hesitated. "You think I should say yes?" "I think you should do whatever feels right. But if you're asking me, yeah, you'd be damn good at it." She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Then she hit reply. "I'd love to discuss the opportunity further. Let's set up a call. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new." A week later, Lisa was sitting in a boardroom with Ava, going over the first case she'd be working on. A young black couple had been driven out of their neighborhood by racist neighbors, harassed until they had no choice but to leave. No arrests had been made. No one had been held accountable. Lisa listened to the details, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. It was like hearing an echo of her own story. She looked at Ava. "Where do we start?" Ava smiled. "With the truth." Lisa nodded. It was time to fight again. Lisa never thought she'd find herself on the other side of the fight. Not as the victim, not as someone desperate for justice, but as the one helping others seek it. Yet here she was, sitting across from a young woman named Danielle Carter, who had lost everything just like Lisa once had. Danielle's voice was shaky as she spoke, her hands wringing a napkin between her fingers. "We moved into the neighborhood 3 months ago. It started with small things. A slashed tire, a broken porch light, then the messages." Lisa's stomach twisted. She already knew where this was going. What kind of messages? Danielle swallowed hard. Threats, telling us to leave, that we didn't belong. Ava, sitting beside Lisa, took notes. "Did you go to the police?" Danielle let out a bitter laugh. "Of course. They said there wasn't enough evidence, that it could be kids playing pranks." Lisa clenched her jaw. "And then," Danielle's voice dropped, "then they set our house on fire." Lisa exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. "Did you see who did it?" Danielle shook her head. "No, but our neighbor did. She's scared to testify, but she told me she saw 2 men running from the house." Ava tapped her pen against the notepad. "We need to talk to her." Lisa reached for Danielle's hand. "We're going to help you." Danielle's eyes welled with tears. "I don't even know where to start." Lisa squeezed her hand. "I do." Later that evening, Lisa sat on her porch, watching Malcolm play with Elijah in the yard. The sound of her son's laughter filled the air, a sound she had feared she'd never hear again after everything they had been through. She thought about Danielle, about the countless other families who had been terrorized, pushed out, forgotten. Malcolm joined her on the porch, wiping sweat from his brow. "Long day?" Lisa nodded. "Danielle's case feels too familiar." Malcolm sat down beside her. "Because it is." She glanced at him. "You ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't fought back?" Malcolm was quiet for a moment. Then he shook his head. "I don't let myself. We did fight back. And we won." Lisa exhaled. "It doesn't feel like enough." Malcolm smiled slightly. "It won't ever feel like enough. But every fight we win means someone else won't have to go through what we did." Lisa looked back at Elijah, who was chasing fireflies, his face glowing with joy. She took Malcolm's hand. "We keep fighting," Malcolm nodded. "Yeah, we do." The night stretched around them, calm, safe. For the first time in a long time, Lisa believed in the future. And she wasn't afraid of the fight ahead. Because this time, she wasn't alone. She never would be again. "Do you fear retaliation?" Ava stepped in, shielding them. No further comments at this time. Lisa and Malcolm pushed through the crowd, but just as they reached the exit, a voice stopped them cold. "This isn't over." Henry stood nearby, flanked by his lawyers, his sharp gaze locked onto Malcolm. He wasn't shouting, wasn't making a scene, but the threat in his voice was unmistakable. Malcolm turned slowly. "You already lost, Henry. It's just a matter of time now." Henry chuckled. "You think so?" He leaned in slightly. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Ava stepped between them. "Are you threatening my clients, Mr. Whitaker? Because I'd love to add witness intimidation to your list of charges." Henry's jaw twitched, but he didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing through a back exit with his lawyers trailing behind him. Lisa grabbed Malcolm's arm. "He's scared." Malcolm nodded. But scared men do desperate things. The trial was set and the national media latched onto the case. The Johnsons were being hailed as fighters, survivors, a symbol of the ongoing battle against racial injustice. But with support came backlash. Threats began pouring in. Anonymous messages, phone calls at odd hours, slurs painted across the remains of their burned-down house. Then, one morning, Lisa walked outside and froze. Their car had been trashed. Windows smashed, tires slashed. The words "liars" and "burn it again" spray-painted across the doors. She felt her stomach drop. Malcolm appeared behind her, his face darkening. "We're getting security." Ava arrived soon after, taking photos of the damage, documenting everything. "I'll notify the police, but don't expect much from them." Lisa crossed her arms. "Then we handle it ourselves." They installed security cameras around their temporary home, hired private security for Elijah's school drop-offs. The protests outside the courthouse grew louder. Some people held signs demanding justice. Others, emboldened by Henry's supporters, shouted at them, called them frauds. And then came the break-in. Lisa had just put Elijah to bed when the sound of shattering glass made her heart stop. Malcolm was up in an instant, racing toward the sound. Lisa grabbed her phone, dialing 911 as she ran after him. A dark figure was moving through their kitchen, knocking over furniture, searching for something. Malcolm didn't hesitate, he charged. A struggle broke out, the intruder throwing wild punches as Malcolm slammed him against the counter. Lisa hit the lights, and the man's face came into view. It wasn't Henry. It was one of Henry's old friends. The man sneered. "You think you're gonna win this? You think people like you can take him down?" Malcolm didn't let go. "Get out of my house." The sirens grew louder outside. The man twisted out of Malcolm's grip and bolted for the back door, disappearing before the cops arrived. Lisa's hands were shaking as she locked the doors. Ava arrived minutes later. "This isn't just about Henry anymore," she said. "This is about the people who've been protecting him all these years. They're scared, and they should be." Lisa took a shaky breath. "We finished this." The courtroom was packed on the first day of Henry Whitaker's trial. The media presence was overwhelming, cameras flashing, reporters whispering as the jury took their seats. Henry sat at the defendant's table, expression unreadable. His legal team looked confident, but Lisa noticed the tension in Henry's posture, the tightness in his jaw. He wasn't as sure of himself anymore. The prosecution laid out the case piece by piece, the footage, the messages, Mike Tanner's testimony. Then came the most damning piece of evidence, the recording of Henry bragging about the fire. Lisa watched as the jury listened, their faces shifting from neutral to disgusted. Henry's lawyer tried to argue that it was taken out of context, that it was just a joke. No one was laughing. Lisa sat with Elijah in the front row, her heart pounding with every witness called to the stand. Malcolm testified about the years of harassment, the fear they had lived in. And then it was Lisa's turn. She took the stand, her hands gripping the sides of the chair as she faced the courtroom. "I want to be clear," she said, her voice strong. "This wasn't just an act of hate. This was an attempt to erase us, to make sure my family never felt safe again. And for too long, people like Henry have gotten away with it." She turned to the jury. But not this time. The closing arguments were brutal. The defense tried everything, calling the evidence unreliable, suggesting Henry was a victim of cancel culture, even hinting that Malcolm's past wrongful conviction made the Johnsons untrustworthy. Ava shut them down with cold, hard facts. "This isn't about his past. This is about what Henry Whitaker did. We all heard it. We all saw it. And now we decide if we let men like him walk free." The jury left to deliberate. Lisa's hands were clammy as she sat beside Malcolm, waiting. The minutes stretched into hours. Then the bailiff returned. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the paper in his hands. "On the charge of first-degree arson, we find the defendant guilty." Lisa exhaled sharply, gripping Malcolm's hand. "On the charge of attempted murder, guilty." A low murmur ran through the courtroom. Henry's face finally cracked. His lawyer whispered something frantically, but it didn't matter anymore. "On the charge of committing a hate crime, guilty." The judge nodded. "Mr. Whitaker, you have been found guilty on all counts. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in prison." Lisa closed her eyes, letting the relief crash over her. Malcolm exhaled beside her. It was over. Henry was led away in handcuffs, his gaze dark with rage, but Lisa didn't care. For the first time in years, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Peace. The Johnsons didn't go back to their old neighborhood. There was nothing left there for them. But their story changed things. The case set a legal precedent, strengthening hate crime legislation in their state. People who had once been silent about the injustices in their community started speaking up. Malcolm and Lisa moved into a new home, one where they didn't have to look over their shoulders. And as Lisa watched Elijah play in their backyard, laughter spilling into the warm air, she knew they had one. Not just in court, but in life. The weight of everything that had happened didn't hit Lisa until the night after the trial. She sat on the back porch of their new home, the distant hum of the city in the background, the scent of fresh grass in the air. It was supposed to feel like victory, like relief, but all she felt was exhaustion. Malcolm stepped out, 2 mugs of tea in his hands. He set one down in front of her before taking a seat beside her. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, staring out into the night like she was. "You okay?" he finally asked. Lisa let out a tired laugh. "I should be, but I don't know. It still doesn't feel real." Malcolm took a sip of his tea, nodding. "We fought so hard to get here. Maybe our minds haven't caught up yet." Lisa exhaled slowly. "I keep thinking about all the people who didn't get justice. People who didn't have cameras, lawyers, media attention. What if we had just been another statistic?"